Hi, Sean Kidney here from the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm here today to present a short webinar on our Bonds and Climate Change State of the Market 2016 report. Thank you for joining the call. This is, from an audio perspective, a listen-only webinar. However, you can ask questions, and I encourage you to ask questions through the typing interface. And we'll try and respond to them. I'll respond to them during the course of the conversation. The Bonds and Climate Change Report is something we do each year to promote the idea of investment in climate change-related sectors that need to be addressed to achieve a rapid transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy. This morning, I had the privilege of walking past the Bank of England, the Royal Exchange buildings and the City of London, ending up here during this webinar. And I was reflecting on just how far we had come sitting in the world's international finance capital when green bonds have now become part of the international financial discourse. In the G20 financial ministers' statement issued this week, there's a note about the importance of pursuing and promoting green bonds. Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, has made numerous speeches mentioning and urging the utilisation of green bonds as one financing instrument to address the challenges of climate change and environmental sustainability. We have bonds appearing around the planet. This is a big and rapid change, a welcome one in the context of our relatively slow grappling with the issue of climate change. I'm going to take you through a couple of headlines around the labelled green bond market. Then I'm going to talk about the unlabelled or climate-aligned green bond market that is the subject of the bulk of this report. And then we're going to finish up with next. Where to from now? Let me start the slide deck by first just explaining what the Climate Bonds Initiative is. We're an NGO, a non-government organisation, focusing on mobilising capital for climate solutions. We do a lot of work around market developments. We've been working for 3 years with the Central Bank of China, for example, on proposals to develop a green bond market in China, which is now underway. Mexico, Brazil, India. We look at green aggregation. We have a project, the global one, with UNDP, where we'll be promoting green securitization, green aggregation and other forms. Look at policy. Some of you will know that we also run a global climate bond standards and certification scheme to provide an easy-to-use tool for investors about assessing the green credentials of a bond. And we do, of course, market analysis reporting, hence this particular report that we're about to do. We're here today because the green bonds market has been making headlines. We've seen a fairly substantial growth, albeit from very modest beginnings. It's worth noting the global bond market is $100 trillion outstanding. The global green bond, the labelled green bond market, is $118 billion outstanding, a small piece of the global market. But as you'll see from this chart, fairly rapid growth. We've in fact just passed 44 billion of issuance in 2016 today. Didn't get time to update this chart. We believe we're on track for about 100 billion over the course of the calendar year, which would take us back onto the trajectory. We had a bit of a hiccup last year, mainly because of the stalling in the US market issuance, and the Chinese regulatory market came to fruition a little late. You will see about this chart in the labelled market, we now have a variety of sectors issuing. It's not just development banks who began this whole green bond movement, but it's also corporates, municipals, cities, and banks, which have become a big chunk of this market in 2016. This market is essentially a marketing theme. It's a way of promoting bonds where the proceeds go to assets and projects that make a material difference to addressing climate change and environmental challenges we face. What's been unusual in this labelled green bond market, and by labelled I mean bonds that have been taken to market by their issuers consciously and explicitly proclaiming their green status. In this particular market, the dominant sector is made up of bonds backed by treasuries of blue chip organisations such as major corporations or banks or development banks, where the proceeds are going to a subset of their overall investment plan or a subset of their assets, which qualify as green for the purpose of this market. That's been an innovation. This is an unusual thing which has existed in sovereign bonds in the past, with war bonds or railway bonds in the 1860s, and with development bank bonds over the last 15 years in some markets. This idea took amongst corporates and banks in 2013 in the wake of the International Finance Corporation's two $1 billion green bonds that sold out very quickly, less than 2 hours, and were still oversubscribed, which awoke the investment community to a new thematic opportunity that might be available. Since then, we've seen a whole lot of developments that I'll come to in a minute, but that's the headline for today. It's important to note that this labelled green bond market is actually a global market. We've seen 24 billion out of the US, yes, 15 billion out of France, 11 billion out of that small but plucky and dynamic state of the Netherlands, and now 14 billion out of China. Even Australia, 2 billion, South Australia, 1 billion. And we've heard rumours, or really newspaper reports, about forthcoming bond issuance in Morocco, Nigeria, and Kenya. This is truly taking on a global flavour, this market. It's built on the back of investor interest. We have globally some $93 trillion of assets under management in what's called the institutional investor sector. A chunk of that claims to be focused on socially responsible investments. 21 trillion globally. You'll see variations of that theme, sometimes as low as 13 trillion, depending on who's included. A lot of that is rhetorical, which explains some of the difference between the 13 and 21 trillion. But nevertheless, an interest on those investors, on the part of those investors, in responsible investment of one sort. Another symptom of what's going on in the institutional investor sector has been statements made, for example, at the UN Climate Summit in September 2014, by groups of institutional investors about the importance of tackling climate change as a material threat to their long-term portfolios, as something that they felt governments should act on. And at the UN Climate Summit, where we had a total of about $60 trillion of assets under management represented in statements to the UN Secretary General and to the broader summit, we had commitments to invest in climate change solutions. Of course, these are commitments subject to being able to meet the risk and yield requirements of those institutions. These are risk and yield requirements largely guided, not entirely, but largely guided by regulatory environments. For example, in India, we say that insurance funds can only invest in AAA and AA Indian bonds. They're not allowed to invest in A or BB. This is a regulatory requirement. So within those regulatory requirements, investors were saying they were ready to invest in climate change solutions as being part of achieving a transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy in the time frame that scientists around the world have been telling us. The insurance industry actually made a commitment to multiply by 10 their climate-related investments by 2020. We've also seen central banks become green bond buyers as part of a strategy to support the development of investments relevant to the sustainability, including the environmental sustainability of their economies. And in Paris, at the Climate Change Conference in December, we saw a Paris Green Bond statement issued with $11.2 trillion of investors saying they stood ready specifically to invest in and help grow the green bond market because they thought that was going to be useful to address their concerns about the material impact of climate change. That's the background. So what's actually going on here? Institutional investors, particularly pension funds and insurance funds that you'll see from that chart make up the 2/3 of this particular sector, are largely acutely aware of long-term risks. It's part of their business to look at what long-term risks are for the business. Insurance funds in particular reinsurance funds in particular, have for some time been quite vocal about the need to address climate change and looking for ways to do it, particularly in their policy writing side. We've had some funds, like an example is a major insurance fund in Australia that writes flood prevention insurance for businesses and has built into that particular scheme education of businesses about how to become more flood resilient. Store your material on level above ground floor, not on ground floor, for example. These are actually active programs that many insurers are running around the world in response to their understanding of climate changes that we're experiencing already and will continue to experience in the future. They've read the International Energy Agency report, which says that we are currently barreling, that's the press release term, towards a world of 6 to 7 degrees Celsius warming. That is 10 degrees over land, 14 degrees over the Arctic. These are extraordinary temperature rises that the planet will need to endure thanks to the impact of human beings on the level of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. When climate scientists and the International Energy Agency talk about this impact, you will hear stories of, at the moment, a likely global devastation. You will hear stories of increased desertification. You will hear predictions of massive changes in rainfall patterns, such as the Indian monsoon, most likely failing 1 year in 5, with devastating impact on the billion people in the subcontinent who rely on that monsoon for water every year. You will see talk about a dramatic change of agricultural patterns around Latin America, the likely failure of the maize crop in Mexico, the shifting of agricultural zones north. It'll be great for Canada. It won't be so good for the breadbasket of the world, the US, or that other breadbasket of the world for that matter, the Mekong Delta, the largest single regional producer of rice in the world, which is so low-lying that it's likely to experience a dramatic sea level rise, storm surge impact, and salinification of the Mekong Delta, wiping out that rice-producing region, which is so critical to the world's food supply. We know that when we see these kinds of changes, as we have already seen in the Middle East in the last few years, revolutions, tinderboxes sure, but set alight by the dramatic changes in food prices caused by the heat spikes, the unusual, the extraordinary heat spikes in Russia in the 2006 to 2009 period, which led to a collapse of wheat, which led to Russia stopping the exports of wheat, which led to a massive spike in the wheat prices globally, and those countries that weren't hedged against that price, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, all suffered significantly as a result. People's food prices went through the roof, and we saw that leading to civil unrest, for better or for worse. For better, perhaps in Tunisia. In other countries, I'll leave you to make the judgment. The Syrian war itself, as President Obama has said recently, its roots lie in the shifting of people from the Syrian countryside, the 2006 to 2009 period, as a result of a series of extended heat spots in Syria, which led to the collapse of agricultural production. 1.6 million people moved into the cities in that period. No jobs, just repression. Now we have a war. We can expect to see this happening globally on current trajectories. We can expect to see Somalias around the world, collapsed states, on steroids. We can expect to see the rise of epidemics as a result of collapsed states and intense environmental pressures. We can expect to see flooding, followed by drought, followed by flooding, at increased intensity than we've ever experienced before. And that won't just be the poor countries, but we know it'll be the poor countries of the world that will suffer. It will also be Australia. It will also be northern China, which is incredibly exposed. It'll be the US, and it'll be southern Europe. Now, I'm going on a bit about this because actually insurance funds and many pension funds are acutely aware of this very grim scenario. The Institute of Actuaries, a couple of years ago, put out a report saying that by 2050, on current trajectories, there was a very good chance that pension funds and insurance fund portfolios will be decimated. Why? For all the reasons I've just mentioned and the impact on the global economy. Some financiers do make money out of steep volatility. Most pension funds and insurance funds don't. They need some sort of predictability, as we do for our economies to flourish, for our children to be able to be educated in a safe, secure way without having to deal through wars and epidemics coming through. So we need to understand the risks here. Now, nothing's certain in life. We could be hit by a meteorite tomorrow and the whole world is done for. But if you talk to climate scientists, you will find that they talk about this as a minimum 50% probability. None of us would get into a car if we felt there was a 50% or more chance of having an accident. That's what we are doing with the global economy and environment. When you read the International Energy Agency's report, however, there are a couple of glimmers of hope. The first glimmer of hope is that when you look at what's got to be done, and I'm going to say Bill Gates is wrong. He came out yesterday and said we need R&D around energy. In fact, most of what we need to do globally is well and truly in place when it comes to technology, when it comes to knowledge, know-how. It's energy systems going clean, green. It is mobility, moving to mass transit or non-fossil fuel-based systems. It is buildings become energy efficient, dramatically reducing the way they soak up power. Building in hot climates to minimize the use of air conditioning, of lots of shade and lots of trees. Building in cold climates to be highly insulated. It is water infrastructure. It is building our utilities to be, yes, climate resilient because of the dramatic changes in rainfall patterns we're going to experience, but also to be low energy. Water pumps, I should say, consume 7% of the world's electricity. In some places, like California, 17% of the state's electricity goes on water pumps. This has got to come down if we are to make this transition adequately to a low carbon and climate resilient world that we have to have if we're going to provide some kind of future that is reasonable for our children and our grandchildren. But these are opportunities. We are in the emerging market building massive new cities every day. These cities must be green if we are to successfully choose the path to low carbon and climate resilient. These are trillions of dollars of investments that are required. The new climate economy says some 50 trillion by 2035. This is about redirecting infrastructure and building spend, changing it from high carbon expenditure to low carbon expenditure, as well as some extra expenditures. Many of these routes we need to take have a higher capital expenditure, such as clean energy often has a higher capital expenditure compared to thermal, such as coal-fired power, but a much, much lower running cost. I.e., we need a lot of capital at relatively low rates quickly. If we can find that, we can make this transition because most of the solutions require that kind of investment. Well, funnily enough, the second thing that gives me hope, the surprising thing about this moment in history, is that we are awash in low-cost capital. We have more capital available in the world today to go into productive assets than ever before in the history of humankind, ever before. And a huge proportion of that capital in Japan, in Europe, in the US is invested in low-cost or even negative interest rate instruments. Some 10% of pension fund and insurance fund money in Europe is in German bonds, negative interest rates, Swiss bonds, negative interest rates, Swedish bonds, negative interest rates. In Japan, Japanese bonds, negative interest rates. This is no way to pay your pension and my pension and our pensions. This is no way to get a return for institutional investments. We need yield. Where will we find yield? We will find it in green infrastructure investing around the world. That gives me hope. We have the capital. We know the projects. We know that the capital wants green because they're signing these statements at the UN Climate Summit. In other words, there is a receptive audience, a door ajar, ready to be pushed open. This is not something that requires a bulldozer. What we simply need to do is more effectively build a bridge between those two big buckets, the $50 trillion bucket of projects on one side and the capital on the other side. Of course, there are challenges here. There are challenges of risk perception on the part of new assets, assets built at scale that were unimaginable 10 years ago, vast solar farms in the desert, new water projects in the Ganges. There are definitely some challenges here, but this is something we've been doing for 150 years. We've been successfully mobilizing private capital for public projects around the world. We have built the economy of today through the acts of treasuries, determining priority infrastructure investments and ensuring that capital will go in the right direction. Fiddling with the sluice gates of capital markets to ensure that roads get built, that hospitals get built, that electricity systems operate in the US or in Japan at 99.9% certainty. These are things we know how to do. We simply need to start thinking green. Green bonds are merely an example of a bridging instrument between projects, assets that are relevant, and those pools of capital that are highly regulated, that have rules about what they can invest in. If we can create a green bond, as we are now creating a green bond, which meets the risk and yield requirements of insurance funds and pension funds in Germany, or in Mexico for that matter, where the proceeds as a bonus feature go to addressing climate change risk, a long-term risk, we make it a very easy choice for them. Why wouldn't you? And that's exactly why green bonds around the world are being oversubscribed again and again and again. The point of this report is to look at the green bonds market. We have some pages dedicated to that, but to also look beyond it. Once you have appetite for investing in climate change related solutions, it's useful to note that in fact, there are many bonds that are not labeled as green that should be included. You might also say that this is a market that could become green, as informally labeled as such, very, very quickly. So if you have the appetite, but of course if you also have the due diligence capability, which is required, we're giving you here a universe of $576 billion of unlabeled climate-aligned bonds to consider, to go with the $180 billion of labeled green bonds that are currently available. $694 billion. Now that's a reasonable market. That is liquidity. That is scale. That is worthy of investment in time and energy by pension funds and insurance funds in engaging. This is not a niche market. The labeling is important. The labeling fundamentally makes it easier for investors to figure out where to put their money. Sometimes it's very easy. A solar PV bond from Spain can be understood by most investors as a green bond, even if it's not labeled as such. However, a bond from a utility in the water sector in Italy may be open to more questioning. The labeling allows us to set some rules about environmental criteria and therefore to reduce friction by providing this discovery tool. That's the benefit of it. Let me, though, go a little bit more in the meantime to the unlabeled market so we can understand what's sitting in there. These are the filters we provided to give you a view about this particular market. We used basic standard criteria. We looked at the last 10 years, and we essentially looked at bonds where we could see that at minimum 95% of all the revenue was going to a climate-aligned investment. This year, we've had a bit more of a focus on water, US muni bonds, and China than we've had in the previous 4 reports. We've been doing these for some years now. You'll see that this is a 78% investment grade market, which actually is much the same as a labeled green bond market, which is about 80% investment grade. AAA is only 15%. The biggest chunk is AA. There are some high-yield bonds or unrated bonds for those people who have a small exposure to that sector. In the unlabelled markets, transport is by far the biggest thing. That's because of all of these sectors, bond issuance has been a feature of the transport, especially notably the rail sector, but also the car leasing sector for some years. We don't have a lot of car leasing in this particular bond, but they are coming to the green bond market where Toyota, Hyundai and Geely have issued bonds to finance leases or projects for electric vehicles or hybrids. This has been a very important development. Car leasing is a huge slice of capital markets. In the transport and energy sector, energy is about 19%, and you will see there are a few small ones. This is the 550 billion universe we're talking about here. Multi-sector involves organisations that have issued bonds where the proceeds go to multiple sectors. Most of the bonds in the unlabelled universe are pretty large, $100 to $500 million. In the labelled green bond market, it's a much smaller average size, mainly because we've got a lot of municipal bonds out of the US weighing the figures down. We see a broad range of currencies. Chinese bonds represent a third of these. What are these Chinese bonds? The biggest chunk are railway bonds. China has built, to the benefit of the whole planet, a vast network of low-carbon transport, i.e. rail, over the last 20 years, including the world's largest high-speed rail network. These are climate-related investments. They need to be recognised as such. As a result, we have a pretty large unlabelled market. There are also some Chinese solar and wind bonds in there. USD, EUR, but of course a basket of other currencies have also appeared in this. It's a global story. Again, similarly to the green bond market, we've seen issuance out of South Africa, out of the Philippines, Thailand, Japan and Latin America in this sector. The biggest chunks remain China, Western Europe and the US. The US is the world's largest bond market, but the dedication of proceeds to climate-related investments has not been as advanced in China, where, particularly around the rail bonds, there's a lot of transparency about where the proceeds have been used. It's tied to development of projects. Luckily, the bond documentation, albeit in Chinese for those English speakers out there, is available. So we have what is a movement that isn't just the US and Western Europe. This is important for us to note. In China, which is our leading country, we've now seen the beginning of a green bond market where the Central Bank of China issued on December 22nd last year green bond regulations. Since then, we've seen a flurry. I think we're up to about $15 billion equivalent of bonds issued in the green bond market in China. The other market I want to draw your attention to, though, is the one I mentioned earlier, a lot of small bonds from US states. The US municipal bond market is very interesting for two reasons. One is it's a relatively fiscally efficient mechanism, that is a tax credit, to support municipal bond issuance to drive capital into infrastructure and important policy priority projects. Very successful. We have a lot of lessons to be learned from this market when it comes to going to emerging markets and newer bond markets and promoting investment in exactly what we need to see in the next 30 years, green infrastructure, that is water, clean energy, mass transit and so on. We're now seeing the beginning, as I mentioned, of a labelled green bond market in this area. So the bigger ones recently are New York Metropolitan Transit Authority, $1.3 billion, San Francisco Public Utility Corporation, $800 million, Puget Sound in Washington with a transport bond, $800 million. Our aim is to take this story and to make it part of a global thematic universe in the next year. We want to see green city bonds or green municipal bonds, not just in the US, in Sweden and France where they exist now, or in South Africa where we've seen one, but in China and India and Mexico. But back to green bonds, the labelled green bonds that are making headlines. The features of these bonds, as I mentioned, are the use of proceeds. They are generally vanilla bonds. There is no complicated coupon in this particular market as a rule. Some banks did try it a few years ago. They weren't very successful. Investors are looking for a bond that really is the same as any other bond, with green being an extra feature. They don't particularly want to be exposed to risks such as carbon risk or the risk of the green outcomes being met or whatever. This may change in the future, but that's where we are now. In this particular market, clean energy dominates. Transport's only 12% of the labelled market, but growing very fast. Low carbon buildings comprise a quarter. These are bonds issued where the proceeds are allocated to existing buildings, building upgrades, or in the case of banks, loans to low carbon buildings, such as by ABN AMRO, Berlin Hyper, or ANZ Bank in Australia. We've also seen a growing sustainable water sector, particularly in the US, where proceeds are going to clean water projects, usually that are some form address climate change adaptation or mitigation pressures, agriculture and forestry. We now have pretty well established the idea that green bonds need some kind of independent review. Just under 90% of all bonds have some form of external referencing. Some in the building space in the US notably use a green building standard such as the US Green Building Council's LEED. The bulk of the market currently uses a second opinion, which is an independent review by a reasonably well-established climate change research centre or responsible investment company. A growing portion uses the certification scheme developed by the Climate Bond Standard. The important thing about this market is that banks and corporations have the potential to be seen to have a conflict of interest if they don't get an external party to vouch for the green credentials. It's a simple thing to do. It's now become best practice and is becoming dominant in multiple markets around the world. It's been driven by the Green Bond Principles, a voluntary set of guidelines created by investment banks and others, housed at the International Capital Markets Association. There are 4 basic principles that issuers around the world are asked to pursue: that proceeds must go to green, that issuers must explain the process for project selection and use a second-party review, that they need to track the proceeds and use an auditor to verify, or both, and report each year on the details. In other words, they just say each year, yes, everything is still in order. A development of that has been the Climate Bond Standard certification that makes all of those green bond principles necessary parts of the certification and then adds green definitions, detailed guidance around what sort of water, what sort of transport, what sort of energy investments will comply. In China, we've had a slight variation where the scheme has been primarily developed under the tutelage of the central bank, the People's Bank of China, PBOC. They reference a set of green definitions that have been provided by a Green Finance Committee supported by PBOC. The NDRC, China's a funny place. It has 5 regulators looking at different sectors of the bond market. One of the other regulators, the National Development Research Commission, which looks at certain corporations, has issued slightly different guidelines. All of these things will be harmonised, we believe, in the next few months. The key point is we have a highly regulated approach, which is mandating many of the things in the green bond principles. In France, the government has brought in an energy and ecological transition for climate label for fund managers. They've used the climate bond standards and taxonomy as primary guidance for what is green in that. And they are driving best practice in the funds management industry. More recently, we've seen Moody's bring out a green bond rating scheme or green rating scheme, which looks primarily at the quality of review and reporting and then references third parties' definitions, such as the Green Bond Principles or Climate Bond Standard or the Chinese scheme. These are the beginnings of a global governance framework for the green bond market. We believe it's very important to try and harmonise globally if we're to have a large and liquid global market. In the certification scheme, this is the short plug. It's a very simple process: identify assets, get a reviewer, track and report. We have verifiers from around the world, such as Bureau Veritas, Sustainalytics, KPMG, EY, Trucost, and so on. The costs are a little lower in certification because this is a standardized modular approach, and we don't ask the second opinion providers to develop frameworks about what is green. They are simply confirming adherence to a global standard. By the way, if you want to ask a question, use the box in the bottom right-hand corner and we'll respond. Certification is governed by a standards board representing some $36 trillion of assets under management. There are numerous committees: science reference group, technical working groups such as in transport, water and agriculture, and industry working groups made up of investors and banks and others who provide feedback on draft criteria. You'll find more explanation on our website. Let's look at some of the assets. This is under the climate bond standard, but this is broadly consistent with assets in the green bond market supported by second opinion providers as well. There are a couple of variations just yet. And our goal is to slowly but surely educate investors and as well issuers about areas that can and should be brought into the green bond market, such as information technology and communications. Not currently in there, although the Apple bond had a little bit of this at the beginning of this year. Broadband, for example, is a critical enabling technology for smart, low-carbon cities. We have a working group coming together to look at broadband issues and how you define. Are there rules about what should and shouldn't be in that we need to be cognizant of? Are there unintended consequences? To think through these issues. Early next year, we will publish clear criteria around broadband and other ICT investments. In the meantime, in wind energy, solar energy, and geothermal, rules are already available. Hydropower coming through the system now. Low carbon buildings, very clearly part of this universe. Industrial energy efficiency, a bit more complicated to work out the rules, work in progress. Wastewater is under the water criteria at the moment, but other sorts of areas like waste to energy and methane management and so on are still being developed, but again, we're part of this universe. Rail, electric vehicles, mass transit, bus rapid transit systems, all important inclusions. We have some challenges with nature-based assets and coming out with clear rules. It's very important that agricultural investments, capital expenditures that are required, will be consistent with what needs to be done around avoided deforestation and protecting food from utilization in bioenergy, and therefore raising prices for the poor for food. We have to be careful of these collateral damage issues in the rules in this sector, coming soon. All this is available on the Climate Bonds website. What we will see next: country green bond markets. We've seen the Chinese one take off. We've seen the Indian one get a scheme with some $8 billion of issuance. We've seen initial green bonds out of Mexico, out of South Africa, out of Brazil, out of Peru, a few out of Canada, and so on and so on and so on. These will grow, and we're certainly part of a broader alliance investing energy in getting domestic markets going. We need to develop ambition for change now that's adequate to the climate challenge, as outlined by our scientists, our global institutions like the IEA, and so on around the world. We need to rapidly transform our economies. Christiana Figueres, the head of the United Nations FCCC, the coordinating body for climate change, says that we have about 5 years to make a rapid change. I should say just departed head. She's running for UN Secretary General at the moment. Please do feel free to vote for her. The importance here is to understand that there is urgency to this debate. We don't have 30 years to begin this transition. Because of feedback loops in the environment, the prospect of frozen methane underneath the Arctic Sea releasing in large quantities and pushing methane, greenhouse gases into the world's climate, a bit like an adrenaline to the heart, adrenaline shot to the heart. Because of these things, it's important that we don't let temperatures rise too much further, preferably not at all, and that we get emissions turning down very quickly. As a result, time is of the essence. In about 5 years, we'll know whether we've managed to turn the global supertanker of an economy around. To do this, we need to make clear to government, we need to explain and educate governments about the fiscally efficient measures they can take. All governments in Europe, all governments in emerging markets are constrained. Their ambitions in India, in East Africa, in Latin America, for their own populations are massive. Fiscal efficiency is critical if we are to see the scale of change that's required. We have a whole toolkit on this available on our website, but that's the theme of the coming year. We recommend in every market strategic demonstration issuance by governments, as the Kenyan government has recently said it will do. We absolutely need to develop pipelines of green projects. People can use the national development commitments, the NDCs, from the Paris Climate Change Conference as a framework to start developing green investment plans that will support green bond issuance. Some countries like Mexico are doing this. There are many tools that can be used. We can learn from the US tax incentives municipal market. We can learn from the credit enhancement that the IFC and the ADB, some of our international development banks, already use, and expand those. We can look to see how we can preference green within our financial systems, as the Central Bank of China is currently exploring. We launched with partners such as the Principles for Responsible Investment, the UNEP Inquiry Design of a Sustainable Financial System, and the Long-Term Infrastructure Investors Association, a green investment platform called the Green Infrastructure Investment Coalition in Paris. We had a major event last month bringing Indian banks and infrastructure developers to London to meet investors. We need that kind of inter-country capital market discussion, capital flow discussion, to kickstart green markets and green investment in emerging markets, but also within austerity-constrained Europe that must start investing in its green transition at scale for initial economic reasons as well as long-term transition reasons. We have the appetite for doing this in many markets. China's ambitions are breathtaking, but the central bank has noted that only 15% of the transition to a green economy can be financed with public sector resources. They need private capital too, including from outside of China. We have a lot to do in a short amount of time. We believe the green bond market can get to about $300 billion a year on its current trajectory of growth. Some of that is repackaging things that people were planning to do. Some of it is illuminating things that people have understood as green. Some of it is new projects coming on stream. To get to the trillion plus, the many trillions, according to the Bank of England, required to make a material difference with this market to climate change globally, we now need ambition in the development of green investments. We now need a massive build-out of mass transit globally, as is happened in China, as is beginning to be considered in India, as must be considered in Mexico City and in Brazil, if only so the traffic jams will be reduced slightly. We need ambition, not just one metro line in Jakarta, but multiple metro lines in that vast metropolis, built quickly. We need clean energy to continue to be expanded through government support of all sorts. We need to rethink our water infrastructure quickly to deal with the massive changes we're going to see to rainfall patterns in highly vulnerable economies, such as Mexico, such as Peru, such as India, Pakistan, Vietnam. These are things that need to be looked at now, not in 2025. In fact, this year, next year, and the year after, emerging markets in particular are making major choices about energy systems, about transport systems, about the makeup of the cities. Those choices need to be green. They will need lower cost capital to make sure that the financial decisions, that they're not taking on the burden for the whole world of making the right decisions. Where is that capital? That capital, remember, is awash in the economies of Japan, of Europe, and the USA, currently stuck in low-yield instruments. And there are many things we need to do to bridge the gap between the projects that need to be built and the capital. But just hang on to this simple thought for me. We have trillions and trillions and trillions to be done. At the same time, at this moment in history, we have trillions and trillions and trillions of capital looking for yield. This is the challenge of the planet for the millennium. We all need to work on bridging the gap between these two piles. With that, we have a chance, still only a chance, but a chance of addressing the transition, the urgent transition we need to make to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. And green bonds are the exemplar, are the lead wave of this transition. Thank you for joining us today. More materials are available on our website. We now have a couple of questions. Can you give a specific example of a certified client bond? I can give a few. A few weeks ago, Axis Bank in India issued a $500 million bond in the London market where proceeds were being allocated to a basket of renewable energy loans. A very good, very successful bond, attracted many new investors for them. We've had DKB in Deutsche Credit Bank in Germany issue a similar sized bond recently where again proceeds were allocated to renewable energy loans. We've had New York Metropolitan Transit Authority now issue $1.3 billion of bonds where proceeds were allocated to electrified railway systems and capital expenditure relating. They in fact did an advertising campaign on the New York subway relating to it. We've seen San Francisco Public Utilities Corporation recently issue a bond where the proceeds were going to upgrading infrastructure of the water system leading into San Francisco to be more climate resilient. We've seen smaller bonds, such as in the UK, where B Electric issued, I think, up to £12 million of bonds for solar projects in rural UK. And they offered many of those bonds to residents in the communities where the projects were located. We've seen Flexi Group in Australia issue an asset-backed securitization, one of the world's first in the green space, where proceeds refinance the portfolio of rooftop solar loans. And lastly, while I'm on a train here, we've seen Obvion in Netherlands issue the world's first green residential backed mortgage security, 300 million euros, where the proceeds went to refinance mortgages that were deemed to be, under the climate bond standards, qualifying as mortgages for low emission buildings. There's more on our website. Which geographies, is the next question, show the greatest potential for labelled green bonds? China, China, and China. Mainly because it's now government policy that there needs to be a major development of green finance in China, and the green bond market is part of it. They're the ones who pushed hardest to ensure the green bonds were mentioned in this week's G20 statement. They are working very hard to make this a core part of the market reforms, the financial market reforms being pursued in China. Other markets that will be important. India will be important. Again, the government has seen the benefit of pursuing this market. They've encouraged state-backed institutions to provide demonstration bonds and liquidity. And we've seen some very successful issuance from Yes Bank, from Axis Bank, from the Indian Import-Export Bank, and so on. So we believe that market will grow quite quickly. In huge scale, clearly the European market, with an emphasis on the French and the Dutch market so far, will remain big. The German market is growing very quickly, and we expect that will be big this year. The UK is a little bit behind. There are some stories of big bonds coming out over the next 6 to 12 months. The US corporate market is a sleeping elephant in this. The world's largest corporate market by a country mile has seen very little issuance. This year we saw a $1.5 billion bond from Apple, so when they come to market, they come at large. We've seen Southern Power issue a substantial bond. We hope we will see more this year, especially once the extraordinarily divisive US presidential election is out of the way. But we'll keep open. We know there's a project in Brazil, because we're involved in it, to push domestic green bond issuance there. Ditto in Mexico. These will be small but important markets. Colombia. The government of Canada, the new government, under Prime Minister Trudeau, came in with green bonds as part of the manifesto of the winning party. We believe there'll be quite a lot of action in Canada. We're uncertain about the Japanese market. Again, a very important market, the second largest bond market globally, where we've only seen 2 issues of green bonds out of that market, but we find that many insurance companies actually have large portfolios of overseas green bonds, suggesting a ready appetite for the instrument. We're now looking to see whether we can promote domestic issuance in this particular market. Another question. Why aren't more of these climate-aligned bonds labelling themselves green? Education. Sometimes they don't need to. If they're placing a bond successfully and they're getting the best possible price, they don't need to label it green. That's fine by me. What counts is capital going to the right places. But we are seeing a very rapid take-up of participants in the unlabeled space shifting green in China, in Europe. So we do expect more of that market to become painted green in the near future. If you'd like more information about green bonds, our website has a wealth of data. And by the way, if you find anything hard to find, we are in the process of revamping our website. So let us know. Let us know how we can improve it. But you'll find all sorts of reports, including all these reports on the last slide. The other reports, to give you an example, is a guide to issuing a green city bond, and also a guide for governments for how to scale up green bond markets for sustainable development. We're coming to the end of our time today. Thank you for being able to join. You'll see a lot more progress in the second half of this year around green bonds. We know, as I said before, that in markets like China, there is active government work to develop this particular market, which will pay dividends. The Chinese Central Bank tells me they have 30 applications for green bonds sitting on the desk at the moment in that regulated market. So this will continue to be a story. Of course, like I said before, we can get to 300 billion reasonably easily. The challenge for us, the challenge for the planet, is to get to the trillions, to ensure underneath this green bond market that projects are being built, that new rail lines are being built around the world, when the tripling of rail kilometres by 2050, that we are upgrading our water systems to be climate resilient, that we are looking at agricultural investments that not only are climate resilient, that not only ensure that we don't inadvertently encourage deforestation, but also that maximise the potential for carbon sequestration in soil through change practices, and can help us in this time of what will be massive volatility of weather systems and climates, withstand those shocks. We will have failures of wheat crops in multiple countries, of rice crops. We need to ensure that other parts of the world can step up productivity to meet the gap when those failures happen. That requires a heavy investment in global productivity around food crops. So agriculture is important too. There's a lot to be done. But like I said, we know what to do and we have the capital. We simply need to bridge the gap between those two buckets. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar will be available as a download. Please email to find out more at info@climatebonds.net. Thanks again for joining us today.